Good morning. This morning we're going to talk about art, various art and ways that art serves us in the church. And then we're going to do a technique called Viso Divina with one specific artwork. And then after that, we can do a tour and sort of start at the welcoming prayer garden and then come back in and go through the foyer, the narthex, and into the church and talk about the various works of art that we have in our parish. Advent is a time of preparation, of making straight the path. And we need to sometimes just sort of quiet down and listen to see what God is trying to tell us. There are lots of ways that we make straight the path, not just in big ways, but quietly. As we come to church, the first thing we encounter is the welcoming prayer garden. And it starts an orientation so that we can start letting go of all of those distractions, the traffic, shopping, whatever. And as we come into the foyer, we greet other people in our community. We can start to come together. And as we enter the narthex is the start of sacred space in the church. We're reminded of the chapel with the perpetual adoration, the reconciliation rooms, and then we go into the church. And in the church itself, there will be the seasonal colors, the liturgical seasonal colors that will remind us of the celebration that we're supposed to be participating in. So we have this path that we follow, this transition, and sometimes we're aware of it and sometimes not, but it brings us to the point in the church when we can be ready to listen to God, to be present for God. Rabbi Ben Yoni in the 14th century, I think, said that the Torah is always open. And he didn't mean the Torah, the Old Testament. He didn't mean that the scroll was unrolled, but he meant that the Torah itself, even though it's a finite written work, has the infinite possibility for us to connect with God. And we've probably all experienced this sort of thing where you've read a passage of Scripture 100 times, and maybe the 101st time it'll speak directly to something that's going on in you and in your life. And we can look at Lectio Divina in that way, that it's always the opportunity. With Viso Divina, we need to sort of create the opportunity. We need to work at it and quiet ourselves down, and I'll go over that technique. But first I want to talk about the different kinds of art that we encounter. There's certainly devotional, personal sorts of art. And then there are things like the statue of the Holy Family in the foyer that are more a community kind of devotional art. We also have liturgical art that specifically supports the liturgical action of our communal celebration. For instance, there are vessels that I designed for the holy oils, and in themselves they serve the specific function of holding the holy oil and support the liturgical action. It's made small enough for the priest to easily hold it in one hand. It has a little bowl shape on top so that excess oil runs back inside the vessel instead of down the outside. a stopper that is easily held in the hand so that when it does get oil on it, it's not dropped. We did have one deacon, we love him very much, but he was making me work a great deal early on because he was dropping stoppers just about every week. and I was running back and making more. But it can also be exquisite in itself and have more to say. For instance, by leaving some clear glass at the bottom, it raises the oil up, and it makes a statement, as well as being beautiful with flecks of gold in it. It's also supportive of the specific liturgical action, and we have lots of things like that. The altar candles are designed with the cruciform as the base, and our altar has that same double cross hatch as the base that is reflected in the hanging cross above it. There are lots of liturgical elements of art, as well as those sort of devotional things. So I trust everyone's had a chance to sort of read Viso Divina. Let me just quickly go over it before we start so that we have an orientation, so we're not just doing this blindly. The first thing is to quiet down. And we can do, I can lead you through just a simple breathing technique and quieting down. And then we'll close our eyes. When we open our eyes and look at the image, you should note for yourself the exact first thing that you see when you look at it, the first element and try to just focus on that and not let your eyes wander all over and take in other things. Just focus on that one thing, whatever it is that you see initially. And then we'll close our eyes again and breathe. And then when we open our eyes the second time, we should look at the specific details, not the why or what the message is, but the physical elements. How big an area of color is, and where it's located, and what is in the image, and textures, and those sorts of things. The what it is, what's there, and then that will help us to start quieting down. And as we're doing that, as you're concentrating, you might have a feeling or an idea or an impression come to you, and just try in a detached way to just note what it is, not being judgmental, not, oh, I shouldn't be doing this, or, oh, that's wonderful, either, just try and note what it is you're seeing, and we'll go through that whole process. While we're doing that, I'll read this and sort of lead us through it. This is just going to be just an orientation to this process. So it's something that you'll be able to utilize on your own. Viso Divina is not really a foreign idea for us. Anyone from an Eastern tradition was probably familiar with icons. And that's specifically the way you pray with an icon is a Viso Divina. Icons are said to be written, not painted, because they have a specific path and a way of leading us, a window to God. People often have prayer mass cards, something that will remind you of a loved one, something when you see it, you take a moment and set aside from the life that's going on all around you, and you kind of center in. And it's when we center in that we can listen and hopefully hear what God is saying to us. So let's try this, okay? First thing just take a deep breath and let it out. And take a second deep breath and let it out. And as we're breathing deeply like this, breathe in through the nose and then exhale through your mouth. And as you exhale through your mouth, maybe just make a quiet little murmuring, just ah. Okay, and keep breathing slowly. Close your eyes. And I'm going to put an image up here. This is an image of Advent. When you open your eyes, note the first thing that you see in that image and try to just focus on that one specific part of the image. Try not to let your eyes wander around and just focus on that one specific part. Okay, now let's close our eyes again a second time. Take a couple more deep breaths. And now, open your eyes again and look at the image a second time. Look at the shapes of the areas of color. Look at what's there. There's a figure there. Take in the direction of the brush strokes. Look at each specific little detail. Remembering that this is an Advent image, keep thinking about the what. What is there? This woman has a Middle Eastern complexion. It's not Northern European. She's standing in the light. Let any feelings or thoughts that you have just kind of, as something comes to you while you're looking at the image, just make a note of it. Don't be judgmental about it, but just note that you are thinking that or feeling that. If you have some immediate idea of what this image means, just make a note of that too. Don't get lost in that. And then locate yourself in this image. Locate And in this quietness, you can present to God and let God present to you. You can become prayerful. The image may remind you of some experience. You may have a remembrance of something, a previous Advent or something, or a person or an issue that you would like to offer for thanksgiving or ask for intercession. And finally, bring your prayer to a close by resting in God's grace and being open and considering what at this specific time was brought forth in you. I know that was a very abbreviated introduction to the concept of Viso Divina. We did something in 12 to 15 minutes that, usually you would go through very cautiously and quietly for an hour or more. But I wanted to introduce you to a way of approaching art, centering down, quieting down so that we're ready to be present to God. In the church, we can also do this because in our specific parish, we have, besides a welcoming prayer garden and the statues, the devotional areas, we have a reredos that is behind the presider's chair. And when we come into the sanctuary, there's the opportunity to prepare for the celebration in which we're about to participate. We can see the liturgical season because the altar will be vested in the seasonal color. There'll be paramount banners on the processional cross. When the procession starts, the celebrant will be vested in the liturgical colors. But also on the reredos, we usually have something, a large artwork that has to do with the liturgical season and the celebrations, the specific celebrations. And you can utilize that in this same manner as a Viso Divina to sort of quiet down and get ready to participate in the Mass. I want to show you some of the images that we have. Right now there's an image on the reredos that we've been using probably for 30 years, since Father Henry was here, Monsignor Henry, and it's Israel waiting. We can sort of look at that, and then the next liturgical season will be Christmas. And I did this image of the Holy Family. They're obviously in a stone structure with just open beams. They're in the stable. There's the manger for feeding the animals, where Mary is laying down the baby. And it's a nice Jewish family, Joseph is wearing the hamolka, which is sort of the first century precursor of the Jewish yarmulke and the hamolka that the Muslims wear, and the mantillas that lots of women wear. Something to cover your head to say that you are in sacred space. Space is sacred in its usage. We make the space sacred in how we use it. And Joseph is making this humble stable a sacred space because it's where Christ was born. I'll try to do these in liturgical order, but I might not. Later on, this is an image of a Lenten journey. It's not the exact one that we use on our Reredos, but it's another version of that, where Lent is presented as a journey. Lent is a long season. There are lots of readings on the different weeks, and so there's a lot of visual information here that can be interpreted and related to in different ways with the different readings. Essentially, though, it's a journey through a wasteland and the promise of Easter in the morning sky. And there's a shadow of a shepherd across the sand and up on the rocks, someone who is going before us, someone who has already traveled that journey. If anyone wants to say something at any time, that's fine.
Well, I'm glad you pointed out the shepherd because I didn't see it.
Is the Reredos the
Go, Monsignor Pat wanted my ideas on making a welcoming prayer garden. And he had this little sort of bird bath with a little tiny statue of St. Francis. And he said, well, Dale, what do you think of this? And I'm one of those people that, whatever I'm thinking or feeling, it's obvious, and he said, okay, then you start designing something. So I found out that there were several people who came forth when we started talking about doing a water feature, and I went and looked at the water features that they had in their yards. And at one point, John Utz said, well, Dale, there's this Dr. Brunette, and he has a water feature, and he'd like you to see it. And so I went and saw Jay Brunette's water feature. And it's huge. It has 3 layers and several waterfalls and fish, and it was just marvelous. And Jay said, well, I have this farm and we can get rocks there. Well, there's no farming that goes on. He has a piece of property. We went up and walked around on his property, and he would look at a rock as big as a car. He said, Dale, I think we can get this one. I said, Jay, we only have this much room, But he has his own, lots of people have, toys, and they golf or whatever. Jay has equipment. He has his own front end loader and flatbed truck. And he and I, I'd just point at rocks and he'd mark them, and then he brought them down and brought truckloads of rocks down, and we built the water feature. And I was working on the statue of St. Francis, and I read this little book called We Were With St. Francis, and it's just recollections by the little brothers, not even in chronological order, just oh, and Francis said this and Francis did that, and he was considered a short person, and in central Italy people are short, so he must have been very short. And one of the recollections was that whenever one of the other younger brothers had an alb that was more distressed, more torn up than the one that he had, he'd switch with them. So he was always wearing these albs that were way too big, that just sort of hung on him. And so I got that in there. And then he would patch them and patch them and patch them long beyond when somebody should have given up on it. And if you look down just by the cord in the fabric, there's a patch. He was also described as having an Etruscan nose. Whatever that means, right? But I figured, well, it's obviously not a Roman nose, so I tried to give him an Etruscan nose, and he was considered to be particularly not good looking. He also almost never wore sandals. And there's this one passage where he went to see his bishop, went to see the Pope, and was told, our Lord wore sandals, so it's okay for you to wear sandals. His feet were all torn up, broken, scratches and things. So he made a concession, and he told the little brothers, it's okay to wear sandals in the winter if you have to. So I gave him sandals. The idea is that his arms are open, that he's welcoming us, and he represents just universal love. He loved everything. He loved the fire, sister moon, brother sun, everything. He also wore, as did many of the itinerant priests at that time, priests that weren't actually assigned to a specific church, a cord with 3 knots representing the Holy Trinity. Later on, all Franciscans use those 3 knots to represent the vows that they take. Besides Francis, there are these birds. He particularly liked the larks because they would, in the evening, come together and fly around. They would all gather together and fly around before they would roost for the night. And he thought that represented fraternal love, the same thing that he was with the younger brothers who later became the Franciscan order. And another thing that the doves do, there's one landing on his hand, but there are 2 down on the rock. These larks will do a thing called a wing bob, where when they first meet each other, one or the other of them will bob one wing up and down, a quick little wing bob, and it's sort of like, hello, how are you? It's kind of it's a greeting. It's part of that community. Besides the doves, we have a rabbit and a hare in the front, and this represents atonement. The fox, I said a rabbit and a hare, I meant a fox and a hare. The fox is bending and exposing his neck slightly, and that's a canine attitude of non-aggression. And the fox is sort of saying, sorry for being the aggressor. And hares, when they greet each other, when they meet, they literally will reach out a paw and touch. And so the hare is saying, you know, I forgive you. And this was one of the tenets that Francis always wanted people to admit their faults, and for the rest of the people to forgive the faults that were admitted. So there were a lot of aspects that went into this. We sort of, you know, bronzes are very expensive, so we didn't get to do everything. I wanted to do a doe and a fawn to represent maternal love, and also I wanted to do a wolf. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of the wolf of Gubbio. Maybe, Assisi, in Umbria, there are lots of little hill towns. All of the towns are sort of built on little hills. And the next town over, or 2 towns over, 2 hills over, is Gubbio. And the people there were being harassed by this huge wolf. They were afraid to go out. They kept their sheep penned up, and they would only go out in large groups. And the Italian wolf is a really small animal. So my personal theory is that this was a male wolf that had been driven out of a pack and came over the mountains from Europe and was a different animal. And Francis, this real tiny guy, went out and sat down near the wolf and offered some food. And he did this for several days. And he kept offering food to the wolf, and finally the wolf came up and took the food from his hand. And after many more days, the wolf would just come right up to him and he'd feed it. And finally, he said to the wolf that if he would stop, excuse me, if he would stop harassing the town of Gubbio, the people would take care of him. And it's a nice story, but interestingly, when they had the earthquakes that destroyed the church that Francis built in Assisi, it also damaged the church in Gubbio, and they had to recenter the cornerstone on that church. Underneath, sorry, cold air. Underneath they found bones of a very large canine. The dog, the dog,
We know what that is.
yeah. When Monsignor first came here, he had this basset named Temperance. And when I would go over to the parish house, Temperance would sort of, like, whoever came to the door would kind of give you an indication of what was up with this person. Sometimes she'd greet them, sometimes she'd run away. When I went there, she would follow me around until I'd sit down somewhere, and then she'd sit on my feet. It's kind of like, yeah, I own this guy. And I talked to Monsignor about the fact that I wanted to do a representation of unconditional love, and I wanted to do a dog. And he kind of leaned forward and said, "Okay, Dale, what kind of a dog is that going to be?" And I said, "Well, Monsignor, I think it'll be a basset." And then I made this, the clay, so that it could be taken to the foundry to be cast. And basically it's a portrait of Temperance. And Patricia and I pulled up here, and I had the clay in the car, and I was on my way to take it up there, and he looked at it, and he sat down in the car and teared up and said that it looked just like Temperance.
Wow.
Yeah. So he wanted water flowing to make the noise and to remind us as we're approaching. Remember I talked about that transition into Mass to remind us of our baptism. He was very big on that. When we put the font in, he wanted the noise. I personally think there's a little too much noise because you can't hear somebody on the other side of the font if you're trying to have a conversation with them. But that was one of his precepts. We also tried to add plants that would have been available in Francis's time. It's covered up now. It's being protected from the cold, but we have an olive tree, and it's a mission olive. Francis was very frugal. You have olives that are great for oil and olives that are great for eating, but usually he picked this one olive that was pretty good for oil and pretty good for eating. It could do both. And that's the olive that they took from Italy, from Assisi to Spain when the little brothers went there. And then later on the Franciscans took grafts from that tree in Spain, from the trees in Spain, to the New World, to Mexico. And then as the Spanish missions went up into California, they took grafts from that tree, from those trees into Southern California. And so literally, the mission olives are clones, grafts that go back all the way to Francis's time. And so we try to keep ours going, even though we're pretty marginal for a mission olive. And we also have manzanita olive, another Spanish olive. It's also underneath a little tent right now. Yeah. Anybody have any questions? Can we go inside? We have the statue of the Holy Family from Bramante Studios. I was working with a parish where I was doing all of the liturgical design work for all the furnishings and artwork in a chapel, and I wanted to find a wood carver to carve a corpus and a statue of Mary and Joseph. And I called up Bramante and I said, we have this statue and I really love it, and can you give me the artist's name so I can talk to him? And they wouldn't let me do it. And they said I could go through them and to the artist, and then the artist back to them and them to me, and that just seems so inefficient. And I went online and I started looking for wood carvers. And I finally found this wood carver, and as it turns out, he was the artist who had done this work. Sometimes, when I'm doing things, the Spirit just kind of leads the way. I need to run to catch up sometimes.
So is that wood?
No. This is a cast from one that he sculpted.
Did somebody replace that?
No, they kissed it. It's lipstick. Yes. So technically, this is a foyer. And this is where we will come, and as we're making that transition from the outside, we come in and we're out of the cold, we're warm enough, we can greet each other, and then as we move forward, this next section where the tile is different and the ceiling's lower, this technically is our narthex. Originally churches had a much bigger, more distinct narthex foyer, but buildings cost money, and so it's sort of pushed together here. But technically this next area is our narthex. And on the right we have our reconciliation rooms, And we have some images and devotional images. And we also have our Perpetual Adoration Chapel. When we first started designing this, originally this was the porch and that was the entry into the church, and none of that was here. But when we first started designing this, Monsignor Pat wanted to have a votive rail. But at that time there had been a church in St. Louis that had just burned because somebody had knocked over a votive rail. So he wanted it. He wanted the open flames. He didn't want the little lights. He wanted the real flames, but he wanted it to be secure. And I went up to North Georgia, and I had them at a quarry up there cut the limestone tray. And then I worked with a potter, and we made little bowls so that each light is in its own secure bowl with sand. So it's very difficult. It would be very difficult to knock them over. And we made one lower so that it's accessible. If somebody's in a chair, in a wheelchair, it's very difficult to do something up high. It's not so difficult for us to, if we're able, to just lean over and light a votive in that tray. So we secured them, and when they were building the wall, they actually put iron in and secured it into the bricks. So those, I don't think you could knock them down. He also wanted to have the tabernacle accessible for the chapel, because we would be doing adoration in the chapel, but also accessible in the church. And not have it on the altar, but have it be visually accessible inside the church as well. And so we put an open window at the top so the sanctuary lamp can be seen from either side. And I designed the glass and fired it around the door. It has wheat and grapes, images of wheat and grapes in it, and made a contact with a silversmith and had her make the hammered image of the stones in silver on the door with the cross. The sanctuary lamp has a double crosshatch that it sits on. That same double crosshatch is in the hanging cross. It's repeated in the base of the amble. It's repeated in the altar. And if you look at this altar, the base, the legs, form that same double crosshatch.
It was outside too by St. Francis.
Pardon?
It's outside too by St.
Yeah, yes, it is. Yes, it is. There are two different window images, but this is supposed to be the Bay of Capernaum. On the left-hand side is the small river that goes down to feed into the Bay of Capernaum. And I have the plants from the area, but in the rocks, maybe we should have done this on the outside, but down in the rocks, there is an actual rock that is included in the stained glass window. And that stone came from Mount Tabor, which is the scene of the Transfiguration. And that was included in that window. And then on the other wall, we have the Bay of Capernaum with the storm raging, and coming around the headlands is the little boat on the horizon. And the figure of Christ is not commanding the water to calm, but he's inviting the water to calm. And Father Pat and I had long discussions. I have a degree in religion as well as degrees in art. And we had long discussions about the image of Christ. He was a Nazarene, and they had specific tenets about not cutting their hair once they reached manhood and various things. But Monsignor wanted to have an image of Christ that is accessible by our culture, our time. So he wanted a Christ with short hair. And that's that kind of back and forth thing that I do with pastors. And he said, I won the argument for our transfiguration window. He gets this one. So I agreed. Yes, on the horizon. Yeah, from the scripture, they were going to go to Capernaum, and when they got there, Christ was waiting for them on the shore, and they came in a storm, and he calmed the waters. So that work is directly taken from the scripture. Over here on this, wait. Over here on this wall, this is a wood block, and I made prints from this wood block of the Eucharist. As the church grew, when we added all of this, when we opened up that wing of the church and we got bigger and bigger, we needed more room for more cups on our altar. And Monsignor wanted a larger altar. So we contacted a woodworker, a relative, to make a new altar top for us. When we went to take the other altar top off, there were steel bars. It was glued. There were case-hardened screws. I think you could have set a bomb off underneath that altar and it would have just raised up and come back down and still been there. We had to literally cut the top up into pieces to get it off to put the new top on. And I saved one of those pieces and made a wood block print of the Eucharist. And then this becomes sort of a reminder for us old-timers who've been in the parish a long time of, kind of the roots of where we were. I also took some of that same oak from the altar and made the cross when I redid our processional cross. Oh, okay, now. Yeah, we can go in now.
When was this original built?
I think. Oh, thank you. Yeah. It's about 40 years old.
I'm not from this parish. I was just curious.
In our altar?
We have dirt.
A relic is out there.
No. We have under the altar. We have dirt from Mount Tabor.
So we don't have a bone or anything like that?
No, we don't have. Our reliquary, they buried a handful of dirt from Mount Tabor because we are the Church of the Transfiguration.
Okay, thank you.
Here is the the ambry was made with the octagon shape, which is the 8 parts of the double cross the hanging central cross, and the vessels that we did for the holy oils. Monsignor Henry had 3 vessels, and over the years, setting them down on stone and their glass, they got chipped and cracked, and eventually we had to replace them. And I worked with a master glass crafter. His name's Tadashi Tori. He was actually, I don't get to work with him anymore because he was recruited by the town of Hamelin in Germany to be their glass blower. You know, the Pied Piper of Hamelin? Yeah, that they kind of stole him away from us. But I work with various other glass blowers now when I do blown glass things. Our candle, originally I had made a glass cross. Some of you may remember that. And one year at the vigil, someone leaned the new Paschal candle against the wall, and it slipped over and smashed that glass. So I made a new cross out of German silver. I designed it, and a silversmith made the cross for us and put the gold in the center. And this one is not going to break. There are several things of note. One is this banner that hangs over the font that is an image of the Holy Spirit, and this was given by Monsignor Pat in memory of his parents. I did the glass in the cupola. I spent an entire year running up on the roof. At the time, from behind, it was easy to get up and run up on the roof, and I'd put these little stickers on the window. And then I'd come down to see where the shadow fell in this space. And I mapped the space for an entire year. And you may or may not be aware of it, but at certain times in the year, the light proceeding into the space will connect to specific liturgies. One year, early on, we had, I think our first parochial vicar was Father Jim Atkins. And a dear man. He would always do his sermons. He was contemplative, and he kind of relied on Pius Parsh sermons on the liturgy for his sermons. And one year he was here talking on the Feast of the Baptism of the Lord about how the baptism of the Lord was the start of the ministry and led directly to Calvary. Well, one of the light connections that I have out of this section of glass that represents the life and works, blue light will shine on the top of the hanging cross, and it will shine on this banner above the baptismal font. And because it's a feast day, there's all this smoke of the incense, and he's standing right underneath in the smoke, this line of blue light. Totally unaware of it. But other people in the congregation could see it. On Easter morning, the red and gold from the side of the cupola that represents resurrection, the red and gold light shines directly on that hanging cross in the middle. And all during Lent, there will be purple and gold light. Each week, it will proceed. It will be first on the altar platform near the front, and each week it'll proceed through Lent until it shines on the hanging banner. Most of these light things were made to go with the midday Mass. Originally that was the high Mass, and who knows, in 100 years we may go back to that concept, but because the sun changes during the year, but some of our celebrations also change dates, and they're at different times in different years. I had to change the shapes of some of this apparently simple but really very complex, abstract, flowing pattern, so that same phenomenon will happen year after year. During Pentecost, at one of the Masses, the ambo, the altar is vested in red, the parament banners on the processional cross are red, the celebrant is vested in red, and whoever's doing the readings is vested in red light. But Pentecost, that one changes a lot, so I couldn't quite get all. It doesn't happen every year, but it happens most years. This apparently simple pattern, if you look at it, it's the same pattern, but the colors shift as it goes around. Each side, it's the exact same pattern, but the colors shift, and so the emphasis shifts. Starts on the side we can't see right now. On this side is creation, and then baptism, life and works, and then resurrection, and it shifts around. When I was starting to work on this design, I had made the watercolors of the design, and that morning I went to a Lutheran church, Cross of Life Lutheran Church, and I had a design that I was working on for them. And Pastor Reeder looked at it and he said, "Dale, there's an awful lot of red. Can't we change some of that red to gold?" Then in the afternoon I had my meeting with Father Pat, and he looked at my design and he said, "Dale, there's an awful lot of gold. Can't we change some of that gold to red?" and so we added a little more red, and especially on the side that is representing the resurrection.
You're right, the water's too loud.
Well, it is, and there isn't anything to do about it. At the same time, this section had been closed off, and when we opened it up, I had been working on this design for the Transfiguration window. There's a cloud of light, and it's sort of all washed out in light and clear, and down below is the temporal. There's the spiritual and the temporal, and there we see the three figures. The two fishermen, one is carrying a gaff for the fish, and if you look closely, the net is draped over the rocks, and the two brothers, James and John. John is wearing blue because he went to Ephesus with Mary, and James is in red because he was martyred. Red, we use that to depict martyrdom. And the other figure has that key on his belt, and that's Peter. And then Christ is in this swirling cloud of light, but also up on the left is the outline of a figure and the tablets, and that's Moses, representing the law. And on the other side is the outline of a figure holding a scroll, and that's Elijah, representing the prophecy. And then Christ is in the center with his hands open, welcoming us. The face is just slightly out of scale. It's a little larger, so that when you look at the window, even without thinking of it, you're sort of drawn to that aspect. That's a technique borrowed from iconography. Some iconography is very regimented, and different aspects have to be 3 times or 5 times or 7 times the size. I just increased it a little bit. And the face and hands are the least dense glass in the window. When we went to dedicate the window, it was a really cloudy, overcast day, and just as the water was sprinkled, the sun came out and shone through the face. It was, you couldn't have choreographed that. It could not have been planned. It was just phenomenal.
Dale, do you have all this written down?
I have none of this written down.
Oh.
I think that's why they're taping this now, dear.
I think
Hopefully.
that Parrish needs to know this.
Well, I've written various things in bulletins over the past 25 years.
I've saved them.
Yeah, but it's not all compiled together. Yes.
You mentioned the glass in the hands is the least dense.
Yes. It's clear glass, so that when light does shine through the window, he shines like the sun. It's directly from the scripture. From his face too. Face and hands, yeah. Christ shines like the sun, and his raiments are as white as the light. I'm sorry?
The day with the light.
It's in the afternoon, yeah. We also have, I mentioned the new altar top that's big enough to land a B-52, I think. And then the candlesticks, the new candlesticks, various pastors, Monsignor Henry wanted them around the altar and had them very high, really high. Monsignor Pat wanted them back against the reredos and wanted them shorter. And Father Fernando wanted them at altar level so that they read visually as though they're the same as if you actually had them on the altar, the height of the candles. And so that, I worked with all 3 of those men and moved them and redesigned them at various times. I also worked with Jorge Posada when we redesigned our ambo. Wanted it to have that same crosshatch in the legs on the ambo that we have in the altar and in the hanging cross up above and in the base of the sanctuary lamp. So the legs on the ambo are the same as the legs on the altar. And then Monsignor wanted both word and sacrifice to be depicted on the ambo. He wanted the ambo to have the prominence not just as a place for proclaiming the word, but also as the precursor to the altar. And so we worked out a concept, and then Jorge took that and ran with it and did the carving on the front of the ambo. And here is one of our banners. This is not one of mine. This was commissioned by Father Henry, and it became a favorite of Monsignor Pat's, and it's just, we've used it, for a long, long time. And remember when I talked about how Rabbi Ben-Yoni said the Torah was open, and sometime you could read the same passage and it would speak directly to you? Well, that sort of was Monsignor's feeling, I think, about this, was that even though we see it year after year, it still has the potential of speaking to us.
It almost looks like Father Pratt.
So we transition and we come into this space, and when we're sitting here before the Mass starts, we can use whatever art is presented on the reredos as a way of centering down, of just kind of quieting down and focusing, letting go of, the breakfast dishes we didn't get done, or, whatever, and make ourselves present even before the Mass starts.
That's pretty hard to do, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Talking before church. That'd be wonderful. I mean, and that's wonderful too if we do that. But to be able to, like, years ago when you went into a church, you were quiet.
Yes.
We had
Yes.
time to really settle down. But, I mean, it's pretty hard to do here.
Even here, with our new chapel, it's there's always somebody there. When my wife and I first started coming here, the chapel was a very small room, and you could go in there, and it really became a personal devotional space. It was quiet and kind of apart from everything. I think the first time that I remember that there was somebody else in there was when they were hanging this cross. They had several sets of scaffolding that didn't match. They were literally, the different sides they were taping them with duct tape, and I was scared. And somebody was up there trying to, affix the cables. And I went over into the chapel to pray, and Father Pat was in there. He was doing the exact same thing. But I miss that kind of a space. But often I can come here into the church, and even though it's a huge space, I can be alone here, because people usually are in the chapel as the devotional space.
Is there a standard size for the banner?
No, there isn't. I tend to print them at about 10 by 15 feet. Some of these, the older ones that were painted on canvas, the width was according to the largest width that you could find at the time and at the art stores.
So
They
that's
vary.
Bigger than 10 by 15. All right.
It's longer, yeah, but I don't know that it's wider than 10 feet. We don't just do banners at Feast of the Holy Trinity. We have the rings. There are other things that we do. Yeah. Any other questions?
You did the Stations of the Cross as well.
I did not do them.
did not?
No. Victor Zostalo did the stations. He's somebody who did a tremendous amount of work just after Vatican II, and in lots of churches, I call them period churches, ours being one of them, that were built shortly after Vatican II. You can see his work. But I recently saw him again. I went to the Southwest for a liturgical conference, and he was there. And he's doing sculptures now where he builds up the steel with welding and then grinds it away and builds it up and grinds it away. And he's been working on a few pieces for several years and still isn't finished with them. A very interesting person. And Father Pat actually commissioned him to do those stations. Anything else? There are probably 1,000 things I forgot to say, but at least this time some of it's recorded.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.